Hello, Year 13. This is the promised Biodiversity Under Threat Topic A2, Chapter 4 in your book, starting on page 52, podcast, where I try, in this, however long it is, to go over the entire topic of biodiversity, something we are still, at the moment of recording, currently teaching you. So biodiversity, ultimately the key thing to understand is what biodiversity is. Now it can be defined in terms of genes or species or ecosystem diversity, and this was the first lesson we looked at. But biodiversity, bio means living and diversity means a mix, so the variety of life on Earth. This can encompass different diversity of species, genes or ecosystems. Now an ecosystem is a small-scale environment with living things and non-living things, flora, fauna, which is plants is flora, fauna is animals, and non-living things like rocks and the sky and the sun, for example. They all play a part in an ecosystem. And a biome is a big ecosystem. So, for example, your garden would be an ecosystem, but the tropical rainforest across the world would be a biome. So biodiversity is short for biological diversity, and it's basically the variety of life on Earth. Now, no one knows how many animals there is, how many species there are, but you have millions and millions of species. Some have spines, they're called vertebrates. Some don't have spines, they're called invertebrates. And then you have insects, arachnids, all that kind of stuff. Okay? So in other words, there's lots of different types of animals around the Earth. And then we got to look after them, and they have their own habitats, and they're all different depending on the climate conditions you find at such place. This links in our first topic of climate change, where you can bring this in for a synoptic question. Now, genetic biodiversity, the first one I taught you about, basically refers to the variety of genes within a population. Now, this plays an important role in the species' long-term survival, how it evolves. Now, there are similarities and differences between species as a result of DNA, and it's organised into genes. For example, the one I used in lesson was tigers and cats, part of the same species, but obviously have had different genes over time and evolution. Same with humans and monkeys. In terms of species, we're very, very similar genetically. Now, there's different species over time. Loads of species have been around for millions of years, humans around 200,000 years or so. And genetic biodiversity is important because it makes it possible for species to adapt when the environment changes. It makes them and then their ecosystems as a result more resilient. However, if you lose biodiversity of genetic diversity, then it makes a species less able to reproduce successfully, less adaptable to their environment, or even a disease that comes in, and that makes them more at risk. In the 1900s, the Florida panther was widespread. However, because of hunting and habitat loss, the numbers went down and down and down. So that's genetic biodiversity. Species biodiversity refers to the variety of different species which are found in a particular ecosystem or area. So, for example, in a swamp or wetland, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of types of species there. So it has high species biodiversity. However, in some ways, in some places, there may be less water or less habitable conditions, you're going to have less species biodiversity. And more diverse ecosystems contribute more effectively to functions such as pollination, water purification, climate regulation, and also nutrient cycling, where the essential elements like carbon, for example, and nitrogen move through living organisms, the soil and the atmosphere, where you have the three stores, the litter, the biomass, and the soil, and nutrients can be found in all of those, and they cycle around. And the last one is ecosystem biodiversity, so also known as ecological diversity. It's the same thing. It accounts for the variety and variability of ecosystems in a particular region. So it doesn't just look at the individual species, it looks at the whole type of ecosystem in general, like forests, grasslands, wetlands, deserts. Brazil is very ecologically diverse. It has most, like one in 5 animals in the world live in Brazil. for example. And while it's home to the Amazon rainforest, which itself is large, it also has deserts, it also has a coastal environment, it also has a subtropical environment, it also has a large tropical wetland. So it has different types of ecosystems all within a similar area. Countries with a lower ecological diversity tend to be those with extreme climates, like really hot or really cold, deserts or polar regions, like parts of northern Russia and Canada, but also Namibia in Australia. So ultimately, there's 3 different types of biodiversity there. Then we looked at the processes and factors that influence biodiversity. Now, as we've seen, however you define biodiversity, it does vary at different parts of the world. Now, there's factors that can actually restrict growth or distribution, the spread, or the number, abundance of species. One of them is climate. It's the most important factor that affects biodiversity. It's climate. The types of species can either thrive and adapt or die out if it's too hot, if it's too cold, if it's too wet, if it's too dry. All about climate. The baobab tree can survive in very arid conditions. The one picture on this video is the baobab tree, and that's a tree that can adapt to a severe climate. The American piker little mouse thing was also another example, but it's more vulnerable to warming temperatures as a result of climate change. So climate limiting factors is very important. The A star and A students among you might want to look at maybe some actual evidence of this in terms of optimum temperatures for enzyme activities around 40 degrees. So certain areas like the Sahara Desert might be 45 at times. Therefore, you're going to have a bit of a drop off in terms of the amount of nutrients being cycled around. It's not just climate though. There's also isolation and the role of endemism. So endemism is where a species is restricted to one geographical area and is found nowhere else in the world. Unless it's obviously moved, which is a risky business, but moved by a person. This is an area that obviously just has a species that is just found in one area. Now, areas with high endemism often have rich biodiversity, but because it's the only place in the world where they are more vulnerable to extinction. Because they are isolated, they're away from everything else. So if their habitat is lost, they are not thriving somewhere else. Their numbers will go down and they won't be able to be replenished. Your example for this was Madagascar. It's a real biodiversity hotspot. You know, a region with exceptionally high species diversity that faces significant threats. 90% of animal species in Madagascar are only found in Madagascar. And this started around 170 million years ago when plates were together, and now they've drifted apart, continental drift. More factors, age and area. So the age of a place and obviously the size of a place can influence the biodiversity of an area. Succession was a key term here that we looked at, which is the gradual sequential sequence process of ecological change in a community over time. So, for example, succession happens in sand dunes. They become more complex and diverse, and they can support a wider range of species. But because of age and biodiversity is not always straightforward, some geographers suggest that late successional stages may actually have reduced biodiversity because of competition and dominance from a certain amount of species that might thrive but remove weaker species as a result of doing that and having to thrive. And obviously the last one we looked at was human activity. Kind of a straightforward one, this one. Humans have often, not always, but often a negative impact on biodiversity of ecosystems. You know, clearing the land for agriculture, logging, urban development, urbanization, all these things. Industrial discharges and runoff from factories and waste disposal. All these things can destroy habitats. You can make the soil poorer, you can make the trees cut down. And ultimately, I know, there's things about fires as well. These can be used to control, controlled burning can be used to help in the environment. You can do things to the soil to make it even better naturally. But largely, it's negative impact. But it can be positive. I just want to make that point. It can be positive. So, across the world, obviously this varies in itself. And the distribution of biomes. And the global distribution of biomes is directly related to climate. The reason why the rainforest is where it is because of the conditions of low pressure, wet and warm conditions that you get there. The reason the trees have adapted the same way is because the conditions are there. Now, climate change might be changing these slightly, but it's not doing it overnight. The processes are happening in these biomes for years. So we looked at biomes like tundra, taiga, temperate deciduous forest, temperate rainforest, grassland, desert, and tropical rainforest. And then we did a lesson where we looked at the temperature and rainfall of each. I won't revise that with you now because it's could take too long. But ultimately, some areas like the rainforest have high amounts of rainfall and high temperatures. The temperate deciduous forest also has high rainfall, but it's a bit colder. Then you have the desert, which is hot and dry. Then you also have the tundra, which is dry, but very, very cold. So they're all different. In your table on page 58, you have different numbers in terms of actual data, average temperatures, average rainfall conditions. But they vary across the world. And if you have a look at a world map for biomes and how they are spread out, because it's not just the rainforest in Brazil, in South America, for example, there's also a rainforest in the middle of Africa, and then through Asia, Malaysia, and then down in Australia too. It's to do with latitude. So across the latitude, largely, you can draw a line along the equator, for example, it's the same biome across the entire line, mostly. And that's because climate is related to latitude, temperature is related to latitude. Obviously, climate is to do with the Hadley, Farrell, and polar cells too. But from the map, it's very clear that biomes tend to be roughly in horizontal bands. And that's how we teach it, horizontal bands, because often those places have the same conditions. They have the same amount of rainfall and temperature. But also there's local factors that can play a role in the distribution of ecosystems. So altitude, in a places with higher altitude will be slightly different. Colder, because obviously altitude increases, temperature decreases. But also within the same ecosystem, you might have different soils and different amounts of drainage. So altitude, soils, and drainage are three local factors that actually can affect what ecosystem you find in an area. And then we look back at biodiversity hotspots, areas like Madagascar that are very important and categorised by an exceptionally high level of species richness and endemism, and they only cover a small percentage of the Earth, like 2.5%, but they have a significant proportion of the world's animal species. 36 areas have been designated as hotspots so far, and it means that they should be protected. But some plants are under threat, and we are losing plants and animals every single year. Then we looked at the concept of ecosystem services, not the types of ecosystems, not the types of biodiversity, but the role that ecosystems play. For example, they play a supporting service. As they offer as a service, they support. What do they support? Well, they support the animals and plants that live there. They support them by nutrient cycling. They support them by primary production, in terms of like photosynthesis, making a plant's own organic compound. You also have provisioning services. Provisioning services are economic benefits that directly provide resources essential for human well-being. Food, water, raw materials. They provide for us and our human livelihoods and economic activities. And they also provide a cultural service, so supporting, provisioning, and cultural service. Cultural service is ultimately the ecosystem playing a role in the shared values, beliefs, traditions, customs, and behaviours within social groups. So, for example, you could look at many cultures, they are deeply connected to their local ecosystems. The Van Gogh artwork was one example of that, about how nature was used and an ecosystem was used for a cultural benefit. And then there's regulating service, the last one. So regulating service is basically where it's regulated. Don't write that in the exam, but it's where the balance and stability and resilience and the overall health of ecosystems is supported. Benefits, for example, maybe through climate regulation or flood control or disease control or pollination. These things are key in regulating the ecosystems that we have on this planet. And that's important to do because the next part was we looked at the value of these ecosystems. They are important locally and globally, but they are not equally valued. Okay? So the last part of the topic really for this first chapter was about the difference between countries and about the fact that certain countries have certain biomes And let's take, for example, Peru. It's not the richest country in the world. It would be more tempted to use the rainforest for economic development. Whereas on a global level, that rainforest is more important for the planet as a whole for its environmental impacts and its environmental benefits. For example, the oxygen and it gives out and the carbon sink that it takes in. So it's important to consider that in terms of how communities in poorer countries maybe have help from other countries. But there are examples of international trade agreements where richer countries like the USA have paid countries, for example, like for the Norwegian International Climate Incentive. Norway is very, very wealthy, but countries have actually decided to let's stop deforesting in certain countries. Let's stop cutting down trees in poorer countries. And you have poorer countries like Brazil being paid by countries like America to not cut their own trees down. Brazil would cut down the trees, for example, to make money from that tree, paper or timber or wood or furniture. But if it can make the money from America, who has it spare because it's a rich country, then it gets its money, and the US has a protected forest, which means it can benefit the whole country for breathing. Then we looked at threats to biodiversity. So we started to look at food chains and primary producers, which obviously are organisms that produce their own energy from the sun. But before consumers, primary, secondary and tertiary, going up a sample food chain. And then we had the idea of net primary productivity, the amount of energy captured by plants during photosynthesis minus the energy expended in respiration. I showed you what a food web looked like and the nutrient cycle, two things that you need to know how they work. Now, ultimately, these processes of the nutrient cycle can be disrupted by human activity again. So these natural processes are very finely balanced. Human activities like hunting, deforestation, and pollution, can have an effect, can have a knock-on detrimental impact. They can remove or severely deplete a species from the food web. I showed you the Colombian red howler monkey. It's heavily hunted, and the numbers are going down massively, and therefore this is a threat. Human activity is a threat to biodiversity in that area. And also, immigrant species and alien species being introduced to an area. So immigrant species are non-native species that are brought in to establish populations outside the natural habitats. Alien species are similar, but this time these are ones that outcompete native species and disrupt the ecosystems. So you have threats to biodiversity, this time more of a global one. So human activity is more on a local scale, right? But global actions and global factors also threaten biodiversity. As a planet, we have high ecological footprints, and in the lesson you actually calculated what your ecological footprint was, and all of us, me included, had a footprint that was more than one planet, which is not sustainable. So ultimately we are using more or consuming more than we actually have a right to, and that's having a global impact. It is the whole planet that's responsible for that. Ecosystem impacts footprints reveal how much consumption differs between countries. HICs often consume more than LICs because they have the money to do so. And then obviously climate change as being a big global threat. So climate change poses a significant threat to biodiversity and ecosystems around the world, as many species have specific habitat requirements like temperature, moisture and vegetation types. Therefore, as the climate zones shift and climate around the world changes and gets warmer in some places, colder in others, wetter in others, some species may be unable to migrate or adapt quickly enough to track the habitats they need. Therefore, they go either down in their numbers or become extinct. And then local threats, this time related to economic development. So in other words, a poor country or a poor area within a country will cause a threat to the biodiversity because they will rely on it for some money. So tourism, urbanization and pollution, so building more buildings, for example, and then farm expansion. So these things are three actions that actually can cause biodiversity to be reduced, and it is a threat to it. Now you can do things like ecotourism. You can do things like restricting land use zoning and stop building urbanization in certain places. And obviously you can decide how you farm. But often these three are big threats to areas like a rainforest, where the land was more natural, but then it's being used for these three reasons. And that leaves a complex link between economic development and boosting a country's money versus ecosystem destruction. So you have conservation on one end, exploitation on the other. At the extreme one end, you would save every tree and never cut any trees down, but therefore you'd never have any more wood, and you'd never have any more paper for your books, for example. However, the opposite end of that is exploitation. You cut every tree down and you have all these resources and all this stuff to sell for money, but you have no trees that are helping air quality, and that might lead to the genuine end of the world. So I introduced the idea of the environmental Kuznets curve to you, a theory which describes the relationship between environmental degradation and per capita income. Overall, as a country gets wealthier at the start, their environmental quality decreases. But once you pass a turning point and you get so much economic development, you are wealthy enough to start thinking about the environment, environmental quality can start to increase again. In other words, richer countries have some money that they can afford to protect the environment around them, or not build in certain areas, or not cut down certain trees, for example. Then we looked at attitudes to conservation depend on perceptions of value. So conserving is all well and good, but if you literally can't afford to, you're not going to do it. We looked at keystone species versus iconic species. So keystone species being the species that play a vital role in ecosystems more than you might think. The example for that was the wolves in Yellowstone National Park, and you saw what happened when they were removed. And then iconic species are those that aren't necessarily important, but they are culturally significant, and they symbolize conservation efforts. So, for example, the orangutan being almost the poster boy of the problems in the rainforest in Malaysia, so much so that a UK advert aired about an orangutan, cartoon orangutan, to try and make an effort about palm oil. Now, there are also some financial gains to make from conservation areas. So attitudes of individuals and communities towards conservation can also be influenced by the financial gains associated with this. National parks, wildlife reserves, they often attract tourists and outdoor enthusiasts, and local communities can benefit enormously from these economically. Ecotourism is a really good way of doing that. Ecotourism is the provision of services like accommodation, guided tours, and local products. Tourism done in a way that doesn't harm the environment as much. Doesn't do no damage, just harms it a lot less. So yes, there's obviously financial gains that can vary, and you can have conflicts between different parties, but ultimately start to consider what factors and processes threaten biodiversity, and then what you can do about that to tackle them. And then we looked at, we're nearly finished, guys, keep with me. Then we looked at the concept of sustainable yield. This is more for your homework. So sustainable yield, the maximum rate of resource extraction from an ecosystem that can be maintained indefinitely, i.e. forever, without compromising its ability to regenerate. An example of this is fishing quotas. If you let everyone go and fish forever, with no limit, there'd be no fish left, no one could ever fish again. That would damage the environment. And sustainable yield can be used to inform decisions if it's safe to use an ecosystem or not. Through your homework, you hopefully had a little look at the role of different players in conservation, so individuals on an individual level, like researchers and scientists, but also policymakers, landowners, environmentalists, local communities / indigenous groups, but then also consumers who are not even living there, versus interest groups. Interest groups are often formed around shared concerns related to their environment, and they can, for example, advocate or educate or influence policies to try and promote biodiversity conservation. It can be a small group or can be a large group. The example you studied for your homework was the Rainforest Foundation Fund from 1987, which ultimately tried to protect the rainforest in these areas. There's more notes on that on page 81 and 82. It's not just on a local scale, though. It's international too. So you have interest groups that are, for example, like the UN Environment Programme, the UNEP, or the International Union of the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and then NGOs, non-governmental organisations such as charities like the WWF, not the wrestling one, but the World Wildlife Fund for Nature. And the role that they play is trying to make policy changes so countries cannot, for the sake of the whole planet, necessarily damage their environment, certainly legally, or does still happen illegally. So they come up with things, for example, the UN came up with the Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals established by the UN to address various social, economic and environmental challenges, trying to make a better world by 2030, and biodiversity is one of them. In fact, this decade now is the decade of biodiversity, and trying to increase that and improve that. Then there was levels of conflict. So level 1 was dispute, level 2 was underlying conflict, level 3 was deep-rooted conflict, and hopefully looked at how conflict over ecosystems and wildlife can operate at different range of levels. Another part of your homework was local and global approaches to conservation, so like a spectrum of local strategies and policies, so the idea of going for total protection versus total exploitation. So total protection is the conservation approach where basically any human activity is wrong. Then you have national parks, so protected areas of significant national, cultural or historical influence are safe and protected. You can't build on them. And then UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, they're a specialist agency set up to try and promote international collaboration between countries. For example, in Yosemite National Park in Ecuador, which is ultimately where it's safe, you can't build on there, it's a biosphere. Many local people, indigenous people, use the riverways within the park. But obviously then there is an idea of having crude oil, 1.7 billion barrels of crude oil there, which is 40% of Ecuador's reserves. So it's a massive economic benefit, but also environmental cost. And then there's a big debate about that. Or you use reserves in a sustainable way, sustainable reserves. So, for example, designated areas manage to balance resource use with conservation goals. But then global approaches are also important, as we discussed earlier. Now, there is a role of extreme measures to try and save ecosystems, so ecosystem restoration and ex situ conservation. Ecosystem restoration is the intentional and collaborative process of restoring damaged or degraded ecosystems, whereas ex situ conservation is the preservation of species outside their natural habitat. So, ecosystem restoration is fixing the ecosystem where you are, whereas ex situ is taking them animals or plants out of there and moving them somewhere safe, i.e. a zoo, which obviously has its own controversy around that, but also harbouring seeds of plants, but also the seed of future animals too, to try and make sure they're not endangered as much, or certainly they don't go extinct. And the future of biodiversity is certainly uncertain. The high costs, the extreme conservation measures, for example, afforestation can cost upwards of $1,500 per hectare, so $34 billion to cover the amount of trees that need to be planted annually to tackle what we're losing. So it's not always successful, and poorer countries can't always do that. Now, there's limited funding in some places, higher funding in others, but also ongoing and projected environmental changes like climate change are going to make these problems even harder to deal with. Rainfall is going to change, temperatures are going to rise in some areas and fall in others, and there's going to be more frequent extreme weather events, and these pose significant threats to biodiversity because some of the plants and animals can't adapt quick enough. So conservation efforts are a challenge now and likely to be exacerbated, made even worse in the future. So hopefully that has helped you. Please make sure you use this podcast as a help rather than a sole means of revision. I've only skimmed over it. That's really important to know. I have skimmed over this. That is not the whole topic in as much detail as you're going to need. If you want to be an A or an A star, you have to know your case studies through this. You have to know more examples, more numbers than even I've mentioned here. And that involves looking at your tables, making tables with as much detail as you possibly can. But also, have a go at exam questions. I'm looking right now at page 91. There's 2 exam questions there, 10 and 15 marker. They may come up in a future lesson. But there's nothing stopping you from finding these or going onto the internet, finding an exam question and having a practice. You can do it now with your book in front of you. So when the real exam comes, you can do it maybe without a book in front of you. You need to improve that knowledge and subject strength to make your answers even better first. And again, a lot of you need to practice your exam structure, nailing that intro, introduce your case studies and key definitions. Peel. Your point needs to be there strong. Your evidence needs to be relative and correct. Your explanation, 3 or 4 sentences really with detail. And then you link back to the question to make sure you answer it. before 3 of them, balanced arguments, so maybe 2 paragraphs one side, one on the other, and then you obviously have the conclusion at the end to draw your argument together. So go and find some Edexcel past paper questions for International A-Level Geography and answer some. And I'll always be able to mark them for you if you'd like me to. Use your notes if you want to, and over time you'll build that confidence of subject knowledge of biodiversity to hopefully do it without them. Any questions, come and see me, guys, or email me anytime. Take care.